What if one of the most famous ideas in economics has been misunderstood and misused for more than 200 years? When people hear the phrase, the invisible hand, they usually picture a simple promise. If everyone follows their own interest, society somehow benefits. No rules, no limits, just markets doing their thing. That idea is repeated so often it feels like common sense. But here's the uncomfortable question no one asks. What if Adam Smith explicitly warned against using it that way? What if the idea most often used to defend modern capitalism is actually the opposite of what Smith was warning about? Adam Smith is often introduced as the father of capitalism, a man who trusted markets more than governments, a thinker who believed self-interest alone could guide society. That image is neat, simple, convenient, and extremely useful to certain interests, but it leaves out something important. Smith didn't live in a world of free markets. He lived in a world dominated by monopolies, trade restrictions, and corporations protected by the state. Large companies controlled entire industries, guilds fixed prices, and global trade was dominated by organizations like the East India Company, businesses with armies, political power, and near total control over markets. This wasn't freedom, it was power without competition, and Adam Smith did not admire it. When Smith looked at the economy of his time, he didn't see harmony, he saw imbalance. He warned that when people in the same industry gained too much influence, they often worked together to protect themselves, quietly, and at everyone else's expense. In simple terms, Smith believed that unchecked economic power didn't create fairness. It distorted it. Markets, in his view, only worked when competition was real and rules prevented manipulation. Without limits, powerful players didn't compete, they captured the market. That concern shaped everything he wrote. One detail often ignored is that Adam Smith didn't start as an economist. He was a moral philosopher, and he never believed markets could replace moral judgment. Before The Wealth of Nations, he wrote The Theory of Moral Sentiments, a book about empathy, fairness, and human behavior. Smith believed societies function only when people follow shared moral expectations. Not perfection, but restraint. He didn't believe selfishness automatically created good outcomes. He believed it had to be restrained, guided, and limited. Which brings us to the idea everyone talks about, but rarely reads closely. The phrase invisible hand appears only a few times in all of Smith's work, not as a law, not as a promise, and definitely not as a guarantee. When Smith used it, he was describing rare situations where private actions accidentally helped the public. Accidentally and under specific conditions. The invisible hand was never meant to replace rules, ethics, or responsibility. It was an observation, not a governing principle. And that misunderstanding would reshape how his ideas were used forever. So if the invisible hand was never meant to run the economy on its own, why did it become the most powerful slogan in modern economics? Who benefited when Adam Smith's warnings were quietly forgotten? And what happened when his name was used to justify the very abuses he feared? That's where the story really begins. After Adam Smith's death, his work began to travel far beyond the world he knew. Over time, one short phrase rose above everything else he wrote, the invisible hand. It was simple, memorable, easy to repeat. And slowly it was pulled out of context, not rewritten, just simplified until its warnings disappeared. Instead of being treated as a limited observation, it began to sound like a rule of nature, as if markets would always fix themselves, no matter the conditions. But Smith never claimed that. He described specific situations where individual choices, under competition and moral limits, sometimes produced public benefits. Not always, not automatically, and never without limits. When those conditions disappeared, Smith believed the invisible hand stopped working entirely. One of Adam Smith's strongest warnings was about what happens when competition weakens. He observed that businesses naturally try to reduce competition, not through innovation, but through coordination. When sellers gain power, they seek protection, not because they are evil, but because incentives push them there. They lobby for privileges, they limit entry, they shape rules in their favor. Smith warned that once competition fades, prices stop reflecting value, wages stagnate, consumers lose choice. And at that point, self-interest no longer serves the public, it serves power. This is why Smith believed markets needed protection from those who benefited most from them. Modern summaries often describe Adam Smith as anti-government. That is misleading. Smith opposed governments that protected monopolies and favored insiders, but he believed some rules were not interference, they were infrastructure. He supported laws against fraud, rules against collusion, standards that enforced contracts and fairness. Without these foundations, Smith believed markets drifted toward concentration, not efficiency. The invisible hand, in his view, only worked inside a framework of trust and restraint. Remove that framework and the invisible hand has nothing to work with. Over the centuries, something subtle happened. The invisible hand stopped being described as conditional. It became treated as inevitable. Markets know best. Interference always fails. Self-interest will solve everything. This version was easier to sell because it removed responsibility from those with power, but it stripped away Smith's deepest concern. That unchecked influence quietly reshapes markets to serve itself. What survived was the slogan, stripped of the warning that gave it meaning. Adam Smith was not defending greed, he was defending balance. He believed markets could be powerful tools when competition was real, information was open, and rules applied equally. But he never believed markets were self-correcting in all cases. That belief came later, long after Smith was gone, and it reshaped how his ideas were used and misused. Once the invisible hand became a universal excuse, it stopped being a description and became an ideology that no longer needed to ask questions. So if Adam Smith believed markets needed limits, rules, and moral judgment, why is his name so often used to argue the opposite? And why did he fear concentrated private power more than government mistakes? Because that, Smith believed, was where markets quietly stopped being free. Adam Smith did not spend his life worrying about markets failing on their own. He worried about power. More specifically, power that concentrated quietly, without public notice, inside corporations, guilds, and wealthy groups that could shape rules to their advantage. Smith believed markets only worked when no single group could dominate them. Once power concentrated, the market stopped being a place of exchange and became a tool of control. To Smith, this was not a rare danger. It was a predictable outcome whenever power went unchecked. That belief shaped how he viewed corporations, wealth, and inequality. In Smith's time, corporations were not small businesses. They were massive organizations with special privileges granted by the state. Some controlled trade routes, others controlled entire industries. Many operated with legal protections ordinary citizens never had. Smith warned that these corporations did not act like neutral market participants. They didn't compete fairly because they weren't forced to. They negotiated from strength. They limited entry. They shaped rules in their favor. When corporations gained this kind of power, Smith believed prices stopped reflecting real value and wages stopped rising with productivity. The invisible hand could not correct this, because the hand itself was being restrained by power. Adam Smith did not oppose wealth, he opposed unequal influence. He believed that when wealth concentrated too heavily, it distorted decision-making. Laws began to favor those who could afford access. Policies shifted toward convenience instead of fairness. Smith warned that wealthy groups often argued their interests aligned with society, even when evidence showed otherwise. This was, to Smith, one of the most dangerous and persistent illusions in economic life, and once believed, their power became harder to challenge. Smith did not see inequality only as a moral issue. He saw it as a signal that something fundamental was no longer working as intended. When workers struggled while profits soared, Smith believed competition had weakened or rules favored one side too strongly. He believed long-term stability depended on shared growth, not equal outcomes, but fair opportunity. Extreme inequality, in his view, weakened trust, reduced mobility, and made markets fragile. And fragile markets could not sustain prosperity for long. One of Smith's most misunderstood beliefs was this: economic freedom does not mean the absence of rules. It means rules that prevent domination. Smith believed freedom only existed when individuals could enter markets, compete fairly, and benefit from effort without hidden barriers. Without limits on power, freedom collapsed into dependence on those with power. That is why Smith supported regulation aimed at preserving competition, not suppressing it. And that belief sits uncomfortably beside how his name is often used today. So if Adam Smith feared concentrated private power, if he warned that corporations could capture markets, and if he believed inequality signaled deeper problems, why is he so often portrayed as the defender of unrestrained capitalism? And what does that omission change about how we think markets should work today? Adam Smith never believed a healthy economy was built on extremes. Not total control, not total freedom. He believed it worked best when incentives and limits existed together. Markets were powerful tools, but only when competition stayed real. Self-interest could drive growth, but only when rules prevented abuse. Freedom mattered, but only when power was kept in check. Smith's vision was not about choosing sides, it was about balance. And balance requires constant attention, not blind faith. When Adam Smith described the invisible hand, he was not celebrating greed. He was describing a narrow situation where individual actions, under the right conditions, happened to benefit society. Those conditions mattered. Competition had to exist. Information had to be available. Rules had to apply equally. Without those conditions, Smith believed self-interest stopped being productive and started becoming destructive. The invisible hand was never meant to carry the entire economy. It was a small force inside a system that depended on rules, trust, and restraint. Remove those supports, and the hand no longer guided anything. Adam Smith believed some things simply could not be left to markets alone. He supported public investment in education because informed citizens strengthened society. He supported infrastructure because trade could not function without it. He supported basic protections because fairness made competition possible. This wasn't contradiction, it was consistency. Smith believed markets worked best when society invested in the foundations that markets depended on. Without those foundations, freedom became fragile, and fragile freedom rarely lasts. Smith understood something many later thinkers overlooked. Markets don't run on money alone, they run on trust. Trust that contracts will be honored. Trust that rules apply equally. Trust that effort has a fair chance of reward. When trust erodes, markets become cautious. Innovation slows, opportunity narrows, and growth becomes defensive instead of creative. Smith believed long-term prosperity required social stability, not just short-term profit. Over time, Adam Smith's ideas were reduced to a slogan. The invisible hand became a shortcut, a justification, an answer that stopped deeper questions. But Smith never stopped asking those questions. He worried about power. He worried about imbalance. He worried about what happens when markets lose their moral frame. His work was not a defense of excess, it was a defense against it. Adam Smith didn't argue that markets always work. He argued that markets work under the right conditions. Conditions that require responsibility, restraint, and shared rules. The invisible hand was never meant to replace judgment. It was meant to remind us how easily judgment can fail when power goes unchecked. If this perspective helped you see Adam Smith, or the invisible hand, a little differently, consider subscribing. There are many ideas we think we understand until we slow down and read them carefully, and that's where real understanding begins.